Trigger warning. This podcast episode contains mentions of suicide, as well as details from emotional abuse survivors. Welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds, and I'm so glad you're here. As always, before we get started, I just want to thank everyone who has listened, subscribed, rated, and reviewed this podcast so far. And on that note, here's a quick reminder to please follow me on Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites. And on Twitter at Sarene Leeds, SareneLeeds. Also, if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to this podcast, as well as take a moment to rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. Every download, subscription, rating, review, and share helps this podcast reach more people every day. I'd also like to request that you share Emotional Abuse is Real with your own social media networks, or just with anyone you think might benefit from listening to these stories. Today, I'll be chatting with Floyd, a graduate student working toward their Ph.D. I'm thrilled that they agreed to come on the podcast because I first interviewed them back in the summer of 2022 for the original article that inspired Emotional Abuse is Real. Floyd talks to me about how they were emotionally abused by their graduate advisor. And as you'll hear in our conversation, this resonated with me immensely. I found so many similarities between their advisor's behavior and my former boss's behavior. Floyd's story is another great reminder that emotional abuse can absolutely happen in the workplace. Please note that the name Floyd is a pseudonym to protect this person's privacy. Also, as I say on this podcast regularly, I am not a mental health professional. I will always recommend that people who have experienced emotional abuse seek out licensed therapists and to not use this podcast as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. Finally, I just wanted to say that I understand that the content on this podcast may be difficult for many of you. I've spoken to several people who want to listen to this podcast and who do want to share their stories, but they just don't feel ready to do either yet. I'm here to tell you that I completely understand your decision. As I've done on previous episodes, I am more than happy to narrate your story if you don't feel comfortable appearing on Emotional Abuse is Real. Also, please know that it's taking me nearly a decade after my own emotional abuse experience to be able to talk about it so openly. I'm always happy to chat with you over Instagram DM or via email. As mentioned, I'm at Sarene Leeds Writes on Instagram. Or if you want to shoot me an email, please do so at hello@sareneleeds.com. That's SareneleEds.com. Anyway, without further ado, here's my conversation with Floyd. In your own words, I would love to hear your emotional abuse story.
Sure. I guess I have multiple. So I guess my first time, experiencing like an emotionally abusive relationship was in high school. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that relationship lasted, I think, like 6 months or something. And it was the first time that I also kind of had felt really scared for my life. I've been, harassed and discriminated against before, but being in that relationship, it didn't really feel like there was an out. So, yeah. And then I guess the second most detrimental emotional abuse experience that I had has been in graduate school with my first advisor. And that I think has, I've thankfully been able to kind of grow out of that while I'm still present in the program. But it's kind of difficult when it is somebody who's more of a boss, because the work I've been producing has been really dictated by that relationship. And so it's hard to continue making progress and feeling good about my work when it's so tied up in all of the emotions and the experiences that I had gone through, and definitely impacts my future in a way in terms of the opportunities that I can get. And I guess overall, I've just been really exhausted as well. And so in graduate school, I think it's a little unique in that, like, I had to choose whether or not I wanted the degree or to switch like out of it. It's, I guess, if I was in a different position, like at another type of job, I think it would have been a little bit easier for me to leave the situation once I kind of figured out what was happening. But here it was hard because my degree depended on staying. So,
yeah. I do understand that, as I make it very clear on this podcast. My emotional abuser was my boss at Rolling Stone. And I stayed at Rolling Stone for 7 years because I kept thinking to myself, why would I leave Rolling Stone? It's like the pinnacle of one's career. And it took me a long time until I realized and understood that I had career potential away from this situation and from this particular boss. He did not hold sway over that future, but knowing that so much of your career is tied up in your supervisor, I mean, that's huge. It's almost like it's not the same as a romantic relationship, but you're so tied up in this other person. It's so intertwined with such a huge part of your life, that because it's so easy for people to say, well, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just switch and do something else? And it's not so easy. Anyway,
no, for
as you were
sure.
saying,
And I think what I kind of tell people too is, I mean, work is over 40 hours a week of your life, which is a substantial part of your everyday life. And so being in a situation that is really toxic or unhealthy, it can be hard to realize what it is because you're experiencing it all the time, every day, and are just being gaslit by everybody else who you talk to about the experience. I think that's a really frustrating thing, is in like relationships in general, but in my experience, with experiencing emotional abuse in grad school, I feel like people gloss over it so much more, and like they can chalk it up to, oh, you guys have different like styles of advising or like learning, which is kind of similar to any job in general. Whereas in my romantic relationship, I think at a certain point in time, I mean, it got to the point where it was really bad, where like very obviously bad, like stalking and that kind of thing. But I had enough people kind of help support me through it once I decided to like realize it. Because in any emotional abuse situation, it is all dependent on like you identifying it or the person who's going through it, to identify it and choose to do something about it. Even if like we as friends see what's happening, it's hard to not have control over that situation or know how to support somebody going through it. And it is so dependent on us like realizing what's happening and wanting something different, or even just like processing how to get out in a safe way, because a huge thing, a huge part of emotional abuse too is like feeling like you don't have any options, feeling like you can't get out of it. And but yeah.
No, I get that. I mean, I always talk about how what hurt as much as the actual emotional abuse in the workplace was the lack of support. Because nobody wanted to get involved. It was just like, no, I don't have anything to do with this. No, that I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, So I get it, and it's incredibly difficult. So can you give me some examples of the things that your advisor has done?
Yeah, so I guess like some more general types of things have been just like explicit discrimination, like saying things like, "Oh, like I'm Eeyore or something because I'm like sad and unable to like continue doing work," which also was untrue. I was still productive. I just wasn't like a version of myself that was the happy whatever. Um, and then also just kind of, I mean, I've been yelled at before about doing and saying things that I quote unquote wasn't supposed to do when really, like, I thought our relationship was close enough for me to be able to be honest and say, like, this needs improvement. So, I mean, yeah, I guess that one kind of makes sense. I mean, I don't think that being yelled at was appropriate.
Well, being yelled at in a workplace situation is never acceptable.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Eeyore thing is just ew. That, I mean, that's just obnoxious, and I don't see how a comment like that is productive to anyone or constructive to anyone, and it's hurtful. I mean, it's easy for someone to be like, "Oh no, I'm just, calling you a Winnie the Pooh character." I'm like, "No, that's just rude and insulting."
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it was definitely targeted at my emotions that day. And, I have ADHD, so being able to feel things very extremely is like common. And so sometimes I will have like really good days and not good days. But this was when doing field work, so it was kind of an isolated experience too.
Yeah.
So like another thing that kind of happened during field work was kind of constantly being told like I can go to the bathroom like on site and I didn't need to walk to find like cover to like hide myself. And that was kind of said.
That's your decision to make, not his.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
That was said many times to me and two other people in the field who were women or are women. And even if it was from the perspective of like, and I think how he phrased it was like, we're not doing science fast enough, like that's also a problem. Like field work is supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to take breaks and do things to take care of your health because you're in an environment that can sometimes be really extreme and like taking care of yourself is really important. Like field work is a unique type of work in which like there has to be some type of allowance for those types of things. And like going to the bathroom is really important. Like being able to like saying that it's, not productive for our science is problematic in a lot of different ways. But
yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh, good heavens. I'm so sorry that happened to you. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, go on.
I think like the other more general things that I've kind of noticed is there was like a culture of competitiveness that was kind of happening between me and like some of the other students, his students, but kind of there wasn't any type of like community culture. It was very much like I have my relationships with everybody as individuals, and some of us weren't going through the same things as each other. And at one point or another, all of us ended up experiencing like emotional abuse at some point.
Yeah.
But like at the very beginning, it was that wasn't necessarily the case. And so I think that is something that I've heard is kind of common amongst like abusive advisors or I guess bosses in general, where like kind of feeding into that competitive culture or like, purposefully isolating somebody so that way they don't have support. That was kind of another thing that happened was my research was very like different and interdisciplinary. And so I was kind of told not to collaborate with other people for a very long time. And so that made it very difficult for me to even do my job. So kind of also dictating like what I could and couldn't do when it came to making decisions about research, about my job, about what I was supposed to be doing. And yeah, and then there have been also like some more specific incidences over the years in which like he's tried to get me in trouble with the university multiple times. Things that just like don't make any sense. Like he's ultimately responsible as a faculty member, so it was kind of weird to turn it on me when like I don't know. It's kind of been weird. And then I think most of the instances and also in which I've experienced like backlash have been talking about my experiences with other people, like trying to prevent me from talking about it because that's, going to be bad for his reputation and everything. And he's been very, very, very concerned with his reputation for a very long time.
Gee, I wonder why.
I know, right?
I can relate to everything that you are saying. I think I always like to make sure that I say I am not a mental health professional. However, what I have witnessed in my experience and from talking to other people, especially in a workplace situation, toxic and or emotionally abusive bosses are very good at feeding that kind of unhealthy competition and pitting everybody against each other. So I don't think I've mentioned this yet on the podcast. One thing that my boss would always do would be, so he was the head of the department, but he loved to always have what he called a deputy. Now, this deputy did not, that did not come with any sort of pay raise or a promotion. This was not written in the masthead of Rolling Stone or anything. And he loved to put that person on a pedestal because that person was like his favorite. And I never was the deputy because I did not put up with his bullshit. And I was perfectly okay with not being his deputy. And he loved to make me feel like I was this horrible person. And he would make me look bad in my reviews for that. And I'm just like, no, I'm not going to be your deputy. I am not going to subject myself to this because I've seen what's happened with your other deputies. And towards the end, I did, because I had been emotionally abused by him for so long that by the time like new people came into our department, there was just no relationship there. And he used that to his advantage. He pitted me. He isolated me. So I feel you so hard when you tell me these stories. And about the reputation towards the end, when he would conduct character assassination in my professional reviews, I started saying, because he would always want to have private meetings with me about it. And I said, you know what? I'm not doing this with you anymore. If you want to have these private meetings, it has to be in front of HR. And he freaked the shit out.
Yeah.
He hated it because he knew that I was on to him.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we're getting into this. And I just realized now I'm going to have to put an explicit warning on this episode, but that's okay.
Yeah.
That's totally okay.
No, but I mean, like, that's something I've experienced too, is like my reviews, kind of like performance reviews were also very bad. Like, it was like I wasn't doing my job right. I was distracted. And also there was
that's using your ADHD against you, and that's not cool.
Yeah, I wasn't diagnosed at that time, so like he didn't know. Yeah. But
still,
I've been really involved in like other things because with, having multiple marginalized identities, like a big thing that I kind of wanted early on was to find community, because in my department I felt pretty like isolated and not necessarily around other people who shared my same values. So I was really involved in like other things that connected me with community so I could get through. But anyways, so that's kind of where it was coming from, and I fought a lot with both the department and him. So there was something that went in us so far to say, I feed an us versus them culture in the department, which is also problematic for so many other reasons that I won't go into. But I think definitely experiencing bad performance reviews are always constantly not doing something right. So a big part of why it's been really hard to finish the PhD in general is because the work has revolved a lot around the stuff I was doing with him, and the gaslighting was just ridiculous. So like when he didn't know something, instead of admitting when he didn't know, or even admitting that he was wrong, I've never heard him admit to saying something or thinking something incorrectly, like just never admitting that he was wrong. And so anyways, when that would happen, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a narcissist problem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And so when that would happen, like, oh, sorry, I forgot it was.
That's okay.
Moment, but
yeah, he would never admit to being wrong or incorrect about anything.
Yeah, and so what would end up happening is that I would try to make progress, and then it was just constantly like directed and was always like, I don't know what I'm talking about. And I experienced that before in undergrad with professors telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about, especially when they don't know better, like all these male professors. So like, but it was so hard this time around because like I literally couldn't make any progress on this project I'd been working on for so long because nothing I came up with was good enough. And like kind of getting into like how that expectation was not necessarily the same for some of his other students. So another student who did field work with me, her project is kind of similar to mine, and like some of the hypotheses or like ideas, questions that I proposed were very similar to hers, and yet she was fine. Got approval and everything, but for me it was like a much bigger expectation, and he was never good at communicating exactly what he was talking about. So like when I would ask for clarification to try to understand, it was just like a general like I don't know, like redirection, because he didn't know what he wanted from me. But then also kind of similar ideas that I was producing in my research were taken and published within papers that he wrote. So like the foundation of what I was doing, he was obviously thought was worthy enough for him to use in publications. But the expectations for me were just like so much higher than that. And even to this day, like he holds higher expectations of me than he even holds for himself and for other people, because I can never do anything right. So,
and I'm sure his argument for that would be something like, "Oh, because I know that you're capable of achieving something so great," and it's like, no, he's just putting undue pressure on you, and that is not what you need, and that is not healthy. So, how much do you interact with him now?
I've gotten really lucky in not really ever interacting with him, even though I'm still kind of working on similar research. And every interaction we have, it's kind of just been this unspoken agreement now because things have just been so bad where neither of us will communicate without somebody else present. Which is good.
Yeah. It's kind of like what I did with human resources. I'm like, I'm not having any more private meetings with you, not without human resources present. It's not that human resources did anything, but it was just better. It was just better. He knew. Yeah.
Yeah. Very different type of interaction. And yeah, I mean, there was one time So this would also kind of happen if I expressed to somebody that I was struggling and they went and talked to another faculty member and that faculty member had a conversation with him, our relationship would go from being great to being terrible instantly. And so it made things really difficult because his mentorship was also like if he was in a bad place, he would treat me poorly. And so the emotional response was very integrated into our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of learned to like walk on eggshells and kind of like approach things like much nicer than I had in the past after a certain point. But yeah, something as simple as like hearing something about what I said or what I've done would kind of throw him off, and same with our relationship. So,
I mean, there have only been 8 episodes of my podcast so far, but I feel like the term walking on eggshells is used a lot.
Yeah.
So I get that. So when, just so I can get like kind of a rough timeline, when were you able to kind of, I mean, obviously you haven't been able to completely extract yourself from him, but when were you able to not be working as closely with this guy? When did that happen?
So I think like 2.5 years into my program. So I think another thing is somehow he found out I was looking to switch advisors before I even had a conversation about it. But I started reaching out to people in like fall of 2020 and officially switched like January of 2021.
Okay.
And it I mean, it's night and day. Like I am making so much more progress, so much more like, I mean, happier is kind of a better term than I'd use, but
it's better. Yeah, you don't have to say happier, but it's better. It's definitely better. Okay.
Yeah. All right. I mean, it's very obvious just looking at how much I've been able to get done over the last couple of years when like, yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay. So let's go back to a couple of the questions that I asked you last summer. So what have you learned from your emotional abuse experience?
I don't know what I said last time in response to this answer, but
it's okay.
I feel like that's a hard question for me because yes, like I'm still on track to defend. Yes, like, you know, I'm getting a lot of good out of this experience. I don't think it's made me a better person or a better scientist or anything. I think I could have achieved more had I not experienced that barrier. So, I mean, I was already really good at knowing red flags before this experience because of my emotional abusive relationship in high school. But I think it's made me like really, really in tune now. So even when talking to other students who will say like, you know, something, they'll make a remark about something that they thought was small, and I'm like, that's a red flag. Like, I don't know about that. And so like I've definitely learned it. People don't know how to communicate well to kind of avoid relationships with those people because I feel like that's a big flag to me too, is like not relaying expectations and expectations changing and communication around all of that just being non-existent, and also not admitting when when you're wrong. Like that's a big one.
It is. I know several people who are like that, and not just my old boss from Rolling Stone. Yeah, it is a big red flag. Absolutely. So, why do we need to talk about emotional abuse?
I love this question because I think people don't care enough about it. I mean, they don't care enough about abuse in general, even physical abuse. and sexual assault. Like, people don't give a shit at all. But emotional abuse, I think, is so a little bit more um, nuanced. It's not as explicit as something like sexual harassment, assault, or physical assault or abuse. But it still has huge implications for the like health of the person being harmed. Like, if when you're experiencing emotional abuse, oftentimes your mental health does decrease. You can think about thoughts of suicide. You can be so depressed, and so that type of mental health takes a really big toll on your physical health. Like, I've met so many people who like started graduate school like able-bodied, and then halfway through like have a disability, or get diagnosed with a disability because of how the program had been affecting their mental health, largely. Not, fully, like, that's kind of just my general experience and observations, but I feel like that's a relatively common thing that I hear about. And maybe they've had those disabilities for a while, but they were able to like navigate the world with them, and up until a certain point when things felt impossible. There was no out. There was no like paths to move forward. And so, anyways, I think it's really important to have that frame of mindset that it still does affect your physical health. And I mean, I've also known people who have suicided as a result of emotional abuse. And I think, especially in workplaces, like that's just ridiculous. Like, that is something we should be talking about. And yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I thank you so much for sharing those insights. And also, just everything that you said is just so important, and which is the whole point of this podcast and why I've been trying to get the message out about emotional abuse for so long. So, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Any final thoughts or insights?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit more nuanced, but I think it's hugely important, and probably like a majority of people experience it at some point in time. And it's especially tied into power dynamics and privilege. So, those doing the harm like are often also upholding systems of oppression.
That is my male boss was older, definitely of the boomer generation. And I mean, I used to call my whole experience the Mad Men experience, because he really did have those attitudes from like the characters on the TV show Mad Men. I was like, wow, you really do think that way. Okay. Yeah. That's not healthy for anybody. But I want to applaud you for finding a way to continue your work, even though this person is still in your life, even though he's not as in your life as he was a couple of years ago. So I do want to applaud you for that. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story with me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you once again for listening to my conversation with Floyd on Emotional Abuse is Real. And thank you, Floyd, for sharing your story with me. If you would like to share your emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out at hello@sereneleads.com or through Instagram at sereneleadsrights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988. Or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Thanks so much for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and I'll see you next time.